see, we have Zalman over here. We are holding on page Kuf Ayin Tes of the third page of the copy, fourth page of the copy, I'm not sure. We left off speaking about how there has to be the avodah, both milmaila and milmata. So there is the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, which is the Yid's avodah, and there is the avodah of milmaila, that the Yidden bring our help from above. What is the help from above? So there's 7 candelabras, the 7 lamps on the menorah, that this is talking about the help from the Roya Yisrael, the faithful shepherds, and we bring an example from what it says in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe is there, always helping us. So the Rebbe, by extension, says that the same thing applies concerning others, the other 7 Royim, like David HaMelech was a shepherd, and so on. That they all assist us in our avodah, each one according to the particular level that we need to have assistance in the 7 different midas that there are in Klal Yisrael. And we also said that the level of the candles is the idea of the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the lamp of the Eibishter is an Hashem of a person, because we are illuminating it with the Torah mitzvahs. That's called the oil and the wick and so on. And through this, we illuminate the entire world. So we're holding again on top of page Kuf Ayin Tes, 3rd page in the downloads. Every avodah has to result and has to come about through a change in the person that is doing the avodah. To such a degree that it's called avodah. Why do we use specifically the word avodah, not some other type of word, malacha, or what's the significance of the word avodah? True, avodah means service, and the pashtus, that's what we're doing, we are serving Hashem, but there is more to it than just calling it a level of service. But it's rather Meloshin Ibud Oiris. When a tanner has to work with hide, it's the term that's used is Ibud Oiris, working through the hides. He has to really put in a lot of labor-intensive work to be able to transform a coarse piece of animal skin to be able to make it into a fine type of piece of parchment with which we can use, with say, Torahs, with films, with zuzas, and so on. So obviously it's understood that when one does that to a piece of hide, to a piece of animal skin, so they are making a big change in it. The same thing it's a change that is very labor intensive, etc. So in a similar vein, when a person needs to do avodah is a matter of change and transformation. So all that we've been talking about before, about the illumination, and through Torah mitzvahs, he illuminates the entire world and so on. This is all the concept of happening and coming through change. This is what the pasuk continues, that in describing, in the Vuas Zechariah, describing the menorah that represents the Jewish people, there were an image of an engraving or something that stood out on the design of the menorah that were 2 olives upon it. So what's the significance of the olives? We say about an olive that it has in it bitterness. The inyan hamerirus, the idea of bitterness, maybe l'shinui matzav ha'adam betur hagdama lavidos. There is an idea of a change in the state of the person as an introduction to his avodah. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya, and also many Amar Chassidus, it says every change needs to be preceded by a certain type of dissatisfaction. If I remember correctly, it was also the concept behind this in yesterday's Hayom Yom that we spoke about, that for a person to change and for a person to grow in avodah, he has to know what's exactly wrong with him. That is part of the idea of bitterness and so on, that he feels that he's dissatisfied where he's at now. He feels that he needs to grow, he needs to go beyond this. He says, in this itself, there are two olives. There was like this circle or sphere that was a design in the Menoira that Zachariah saw in his Nevuah. And over there was one olive from one side, the right, one olive from the left. So this is the indication of the right and the left, is indicating all the different types of ways how we do Torah mitzvahs. This is what Chazal say, that one does not rise up to daven only out of seriousness, out of literally heaviness of head, which means there has to be this intense examination and realization of where I'm at, what I'm doing, what I'm not doing, and so on. Before davening, there has to be the bitterness and the sublimation of the person. Like it says, similar to that, even though it's not talking about davening over there, but we actually say it at the end of Shemoneh Esrei, that my soul should be, my person should be like dust before all. Open up my heart in your Torah. That it says that before a person sits down to study Torah, specifically from his Rebbe, and that he needs to receive from his Rebbe and so on, he needs to be that his lips are dripping gall, like it says. He has to be in such a state that he's like overwhelmed by his bittul state. And then the Rebbe says, so we have this in davening, we have this before learning, and so too, it's in the fulfillment of mitzvahs that follows the study of Torah. As we know, that's the purpose of it. As we know, the greatness of study is that it brings to action. That the fulfillment of mitzvahs is in a state of bittul. The one that fulfills the mitzvah sublimates himself to the commander of the mitzvah. So that's also a state of bittul, also signified by the olive. So there's the bittul before davening, there's the bittul before learning, as it says, and there's the bittul before mitzvahs, because it's an obvious bittul. You're not doing a mitzvah for your own sake, you're doing a mitzvah as a command. Someone commanded you, you are bottled to the command. Until he fulfills what it says in the pasuk, that you should make his will like your will. In other words, that's the ultimate state of bittul. The highest state of bittul is that it's not just there's the Eibishter and he wants me to do what he wants me to do, so I follow his lead. But even more so, a greater bittul is that I see that his will is completely my will. That's the ultimate state of bittul. It's like the difference between bittul v'metzias and bittul v'yesh. So he has that total bittul to the Eibishter. Another idea that we find in mitzvahs having to do with the idea of bittul, the fulfillment of mitzvahs is an action, and action indicates bittul as well. As we're about to say, also the word action, maisis, from the word coercion, we've had this many times, that a person can be coerced to give tzedakah under certain circumstances. And the term that Chazal uses concerning this coercion is the word of ma'asin, the word of ma'isa, that he forces, that he coerces himself. Inyan ha'искafkia, this is the idea of bending oneself, submitting himself. So we find that the very idea that we're doing something in action, the concept that we're doing a mitzvah in action, that is also a state of bittul. That's considered that we are coercing, I guess, our body, that our body has to follow through on Hashem's will and so on. So essentially, he said that the olive designs in the menorah indicate all the different levels of bittul that's part of and a prerequisite of our service of Hashem, whether it's the service of davening, or it's the service of learning Torah, or it's the actions of fulfilling a mitzvah. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Though the olive has in it bitterness, and bitterness on its own seems to be a negative. Called makim still in all. Oil comes out of the olive. Even though there is bitterness, it's like Yisron ha'oil abam ha'choshech, that we'll explain in a moment, that the extra and excess light comes out of that darkness. The idea of oil coming out of the bitterness of the olive is the idea of transformation of darkness to light. That bitterness itself, that bittul itself, that seemingly negative activity itself, leads us to a greater light and a greater and more powerful revelation. That the olive makes him forget his study of 70 years. Meaning that a person, even something that he studied for 70 years or 70 years ago, and therefore it's become part of him, the Chazal say, we've had this in a different mimer, we've spoken about this, that eating olives alone is unhealthy for a person's memory. But Chassidus explains this in this context, that shows an idea of negative, that the olive, if we say that an olive causes a person to forget his study of 70 years, this means that the olive is something that has to do with the side of darkness. And the oil that comes out of the olive is something that Chazal says is just the opposite. It helps return that bitterness and that negativity, because oil has to do with the idea of light. It's the source of light and so on. And so, that's also the idea that the olive expresses its oil specifically through crushing, through pressing. Meaning, what's the message behind it? Because pressing, similar to the olive itself, indicates a negative. Pressing and pressure, that is the idea having to do with darkness. Through the idea of pressing, the idea of darkness, it comes out from it the oil that illuminates. Specifically, the oil that comes out of the olive being pressed is like the advantage and the greater power of light that comes out of darkness. So that is the idea that the pressing of the oil, that the pressing of the olive, that specifically from the bitterness, from the negative, from the darkness, that leads from the bittul, that leads to the greater avodah of davening, the greater avodah of Torah, the greater avodah of mitzvahs. This is the reason why specifically in the time of Golus, Yidden are called a golden menorah. What's the significance of being called this golden menorah? Saying, because we specifically in Golus and through the being crushed in Golus, it becomes revealed in them this advantage that they are a golden menorah. Like the oil that comes out of the olive through pressing specifically. So this answers the question that we had at the beginning of the Maimer that was puzzling to us. How could it be that Yirmiyahu Navi and Yechezkel Navi that were in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they saw seemingly negative things about the Yidden? And Zechariah Navi, that was in the time of Golus, he saw the Yidden as being an entirely golden menorah, because the Golus itself evokes and brings out in the gold and the value and the specialness of the Yid because of the darkness of Golus. Just like the bittul before Torah mitzvahs, just like the bitterness of the olive brings out the light that comes through oil, etc. Then another thing that we see is a result of the darkness coming out of the light, specifically that the olive which is bitter specifically gives forth the oil. In the time of Gulf, which is the revelation of the inner part of the Torah. That's the idea of oil. Like it's explained in the secrets of the Torah and the secrets of the secret, which is until the Mamorim of the sichos of my father-in-law, of the Frierdiker Rebbe, how the inner part of the Torah is considered the oil of the Torah. So the reason why it's the oil, what's the idea of the oil of the Torah? So it's because it comes out through being pressed. The revelation of Pnimius HaTorah comes out specifically through the difficulties of the Golus, and in the difficulties of the Golus. Specifically, it's always brought down in the Sikhs also concerning the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe gave forth much more chassidus in an unbelievable greater fashion after his imprisonment than before his imprisonment. And the example that's given is the idea of Zayis, the olive, the more it's pressed, the more it gives out its oil. Then the Rebbe brings another example of it, of where we find oil and the Pnimius HaTorah having to do with the time of Golus. So he brings an interesting Maimer Chazal. Yeah, Shloimer, we could say, she's a Nirmas Gamba Madat Nam Masechtas Shabbos. This is also hinted in what we learned in the Mishnah Masechtas Shabbos, that the Mishnah is talking over there about not doing certain things that the Chachamim were geyser, so that we do not come to be Machal Shabbos Chas v'Sholom. So one of the things it talks about is Lo Yikra La'or Haner. A person should not read to the light of a lamp, in other words, in close proximity to a lamp, because the Gemara explains that because we're worried that perhaps the person might come to adjust the flame so he could see better what he is reading, because he's too preoccupied with whatever he's reading or learning, and that preoccupation in his reading and learning will cause him to forget about Shabbos. So the Rebbe explains this idea of Pipnimis and Yon. Moving for this understood should be Moisachel during the weekdays, Hainu Bezman Golos during the time of exile. That's the weekdays and Shabbos are exile and Mashiach's times. Because we know that Shabbos' times is likened to, that Mashiach's times is likened to Shabbos. Yom Shekol Shabbos and Menucha. The weekdays like time of Golos. So he says, Hakriya v'limud b'Torah ila oir haner hameir adi Hashem shebesoichai. During Shabbos, during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, then there's no reading to the candlelight. There is no function of the oil directly impacting us. But in the time of Golus, there is no restrictions like there is on Shabbos. In the weekdays, we do read by the lamp of a candle. So the fact that we read by the lamp of the candle, that's the idea of the oil, the Pnimius HaTorah, that's specifically revealed in the time of Golus. Any questions before we go on?
So it's good to be dissatisfied, is that what you're saying?
Yes, dissatisfaction brings to growth. Everything and anything comes about through dissatisfaction. Do you think if the Wright brothers were happy with just walking on the ground, we would have had airplanes? I mean, not from them at least. Someone else would have bothered them. Dissatisfaction is always the cause for growth. If a person is satisfied in where they are, so then there's no reason to improve. There's no work on improvement. I'll just stay static and even worse.
That doesn't mean we shouldn't be happy or joyful, right?
Happy is one thing. Being dissatisfied with where we are, that's a totally different thing. You don't have to go around feeling miserable, but you do have to go around with a feeling that I've yet to do more, I've not done enough. Okay, let's continue to the conclusion of the Maimon. I have seen, and this is an entirely golden menorah of a shiva ne'er, and there's a seven lamps upon the menorah. The koyal azman agolus, v'gamal azman the lost lavi. We explained that there's two interpretations of Zechariah's nevuah. One way of explaining it is that Zechariah was seeing a prophecy of what was going to happen in Mashiach's times. That in Mashiach's times, Yidden would be in a state that they would be likened to an entirely golden menorah. Another explanation we brought at the beginning of the Maimer, the first explanation we brought at the beginning of the Maimer, is that Zechariah Navi was seeing a vision of the Jewish people at the time of Golus, that in the time of Golus, they are a golden menorah. So he says, that's why it goes on those two times. Through the service in the time of Golus, in the manner of, like we said, hammered out as one. We said that is the love of a Yid for another Yid. The service in the seven types of service indicated by the seven branches of the menorah. Through that we merit that it should be a revelation of the entirely golden menorah in a complete, perfect way that will be Mashiach times. So therefore, we're already now in a state of that golden menorah because Zechariah is already seeing the potential and the revelation of Mashiach's times in the source where it's coming from. That the time of Golus is what's the cause and what's bringing this about. Top of the last page. What is the idea behind this? Is the concept behind this is the Nagila, this Mana Golus, the revelation of the time of Golus, Nikras, Nikra B'Shem Ner B'Lvad, is only called a lamp. That when Mashiach comes, it says that Hashem will be for you an everlasting light. It's explained in a different place. The difference between a lamp and the word light, and this is also brought on actually in Gemara where it talks about Kiner Mitzvah Torah. It makes we had this in Seta Saita this year. Every year we have some Seta Saita that the Ner is a single lamp, and the Oir is talking about like the light of the sun. The Ner Yesh Kitzvah, a lamp, there is a set amount of its light. It's set both in the duration, how long it will burn for. It's also set in how far it can reach. It can't reach all over. But when it says that Hashem is sunlight to olam, it is everlasting light, and also perhaps he means olam also that it illuminates the entire world. So again, that shows it's not limited both in time, it doesn't get used up, and also it's not limited in place, not like a candle that can only illuminate, or a lamp that can only illuminate a certain set place. The sun illuminates the entire world. This light of the sun will be the revelation of Mashiach's times. That it says by that time it says concerning this, the Chazal said that when Mashiach comes, that the Eibishter will take the sun out of its sheath, and the tzaddikim will be healed by it. So we see that this idea of the revelation of the sun, the light that's similar to the light of the sun, will be when Mashiach comes. What is this light that's similar to the light of the sun? So it's what we've had recently in Tanya Chitas and Sharichah Vamuna. I know Gilu Shem Avaya Shemesh Me'ahelm the Shem Elakim Magim Mנורת. What does it mean that Hashem will take the sun out of its sheath? We're not focused over here on the physical sun and the physical sheath of the sun, but there's the spiritual sun. The spiritual level of sun is Shem Avaya, and the sheath is Shem Elakim. As we know that it says Shem Magin Avaya Elakim, that the names of Avaya and Elakim are similar to the sun and its covering, and Shem Elakim usually filters out and covers and protects and limits the revelation of Shem Avaya. But when Mashiach comes, this protection, this limitation, this covering of Shem Havaya will be removed. And therefore, it won't just be that it will be removed and we'll have great godly revelations, but also, like he says, it's also going to impact us in the physical sense as well. The tzaddikim will become healed through the sun coming out of its sheet. So, in other words, Hashem's revelation will manifest itself in all ways that are positive and beneficial. So then the Rebbe adds, yet it is known. Erev Shabbos Toimim Kol Tavshel Tavshel. On Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos comes along, we have to taste from every single dish, from every single type of food that's being prepared for Shabbos. So the Rebbe says, if that is the case, so what we will be experiencing when Mashiach comes, that the sun will come out of its sheath, that we won't just have the level of a lamp, which is the revelation of the time of Golus, but we will have, when Mashiach comes, the revelation of the sunlight, spiritually, etc., etc. So the Rebbe says, since we have to taste from Mashiach's times, also in the time of Golus, misunderstood. Golus already in the time of exile, Nimshon, Yilu Shem Havaya, comes out the revelation of Shem Yud Kevov, Midas Arachman, the mid of Hashem's compassion and mercy. Ubetelim kol halamas b'cholu de Shem Alakim, and all the concealments of Shem Alakim are then removed. Until it becomes fulfilled, where it says in the pasuk, "Vayikra Havaya Havaya." What's the idea that it says that Havaya Havaya called out? What's the two Havayas? Shenimshach b'chinas Havaya de le'elam shalifnei sik time. There is. It says when we look in the Siddur a lot of times, you see this printed. And when it says the Yud Gimel Sarachim, it says Havaya, Havaya, Keil Rach Machan, etc., etc. So there's a line that's called Psik Taima. It's a cantillation line to indicate, to take a stop between the two Shem Havayas. Why is there a stop? Why is there a separation between them? Because the Shem Havaya de La'elam is hinted in the first. A higher level of Shem Havaya is hinted in the first one, and the lower level of Shem Yud Kevavki is hinted in the second. So not only will we receive the level of Shem Havaya that's concealed in Shem Alakim, because the concealments of Shem Alakim will become removed, but even in Shem Havaya itself, where there's the distinction between the upper and lower Havaya, that will be separate, that will be removed, that separation as well. That the Havaya that's higher and before the Havaya de La'el that's before the pasuk time will come into the Havaya of the part that's already the separation between the two Havayas. In other words, the higher Havaya will come into the lower Havaya. Till it comes down very much below Mizbatl and and all unwanted things cease to be. Like continues in the psukim, that you will forgive us and you will make us have our inheritance. We receive the everlasting inheritance. Eretz Yisrael completely. Eretz Esram, until Hashem will broaden your boundaries, the land of the 10 nations. That comes down through the avodah and refining the level of intellect. Now, through the teachings of Chassidus Chabad, we mentioned before, we brought down for the Maimer Val Totzeres Moav that the 7 nations is something that we can deal with now. The 7 midas are now. But the 3 intellectual levels, that's where Mashiach comes. But the Rebbe says over here, part of the taste of Mashiach's times is already now we are dealing with refining the intellect through Torah's Chassidus Chabad, which Torah's Chassidus Chabad, Shiba Oifen, the Menei Yisparnasim, that the Zohar says that from it we are sustained. What's the idea of sustenance in the study of Chassidus Chabad? Just like when we're sustained by something, we eat food. It enters in us and becomes part of us. The same thing, the study of the secrets of the Torah, when Mashiach comes, will be or even now, through Torah Chassidus Chabad, is in a way of avona, v'asagim, in a way of comprehension, understanding. Through the spreading of Hebrew wealth brings outward. The master will come. This is King Mashiach speedily in our days. Okay, any questions?